Okay, so as I said, I'll give a strategic political background, and it is an extremely intense situation. The one that has changed with, as I said, some potentialities for defeating what is a dying oligarchical system. Now, I'm not going to review the whole situation, but let me make the point that what we refer to as the London Wall Street or transatlantic system has been in its death throes since at least 2007, 2008. We've had a $29 trillion bailout, and nothing has improved. There is no economic recovery. The U.S. economy physically is no longer producing the food that it needs, can't manage the water, the electrical power grids are breaking down, and most importantly, the skilled labor force is being destroyed. There is, most of the youth under 25 years old have literally no skills or no sense of what it is to have a productive job. Or, and perhaps most importantly, and it's something that will be a sub-theme or a subtext of the discussion today, they have no sense of a future, of a purpose for mankind. This has been a generational decline since the end of World War II and the advent of Truman and Churchill, some of which I might touch on at another point. Well, what has happened, I will identify, I often identify the present crisis, and I mean the financial blowout. All that exists is speculative financial paper. None of it is being invested in the real economy. We see this in Europe, we see it in the United States, we see it most clearly for the moment in Europe, where of course the entire euro system, even in the last week, has fallen apart. The Greek elections, there is no government in Greece, there's no consensus on the austerity that's being demanded by the European Union. If Greece goes, this probably means the end of the eurozone completely. It means Portugal, Spain, Italy are all either going to be bailed out or leave. And what the bailouts mean is a hyperinflationary blowout of the global financial system, or at least certainly the transatlantic. And what I mean by that is what happened in Germany in 1923. I mean, money disappears in value. You go to the ATM machine, and either the money that you get out is not enough to buy a loaf of bread, or there's no money there at all. The whole system just breaks down completely. And I include in that the United States. Now, what this financial crisis has driven is a drive by the British Empire and its stooge, Obama. Now, when I say a stooge, I mean he is a puppet and a faithful follower of the British imperial system. The monetarist system comes out of the Chicago School and so on and so forth. But he's also a defective personality. In other words, in one sense, he's controlled by the British. He does their bidding. He wants to do what they want to do. However, in another sense, he's exactly like Hitler in a different way than is normally discussed. I'm not talking about the crimes. I'm talking about the mentality. A control freak who goes out of control. A person whose narcissistic personality leads him to go beyond even what his masters want. And people may recall what happened with Hitler. You know, Churchill and the British were happy to see the Nazis take on the Russians, the Soviets at the time. But they miscalculated the nature of what Hitler was and his attitude toward the West. Thus, they invaded France. They had a very ambiguous relationship to Great Britain. But he was a Frankenstein monster, even ultimately to the British Empire, which is why Churchill literally raced and crawled to the United States in 40 and 41 to get the United States into the war, because otherwise the empire was lost. And that's what I mean by the personality defect. Obama is the kind of personality who may start World War III, a world war that the British themselves do want. But if we reach a point where the British say they don't want it or they want to back off, they may not get Obama to back off. Now, what we've seen in the last weeks is developments which demonstrate that if the British and Obama, now what they thought is, and you see this in Libya, in Syria and Iran, I'm not going to detail all of it, the real targets in these confrontations were to create a confrontation with Russia and or China. And the idea was that Russia and China would back down. And once they backed down, they would be open to the kind of looting of resources and cheap labor that had seemed to work to a certain degree during the 1990s, when of course the Russians had Yeltsin and the oligarchs and the Institute for International Republican Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and they were selling off the country at a nickel on the dollar effect. And when Putin came in as part of a nationalist grouping, a mixed bag, but their view was we are no longer going to be ripped apart, even though they didn't have a policy. Over the decade, they have come to a certain policy. And that policy is a policy of developing Siberia, the Bering Straits, high technology development, and the hope of cooperation with the United States. That the United States would go in a different direction. But the British, and particularly under Obama, thought that they could confront the Russians, confront the Chinese over the South China Sea, the Pacific Encirclement, and so forth, and force a back down. Now, what has evolved, and LaRouche brought this up in October and November of last year, when Gaddafi was executed illegally by Obama and Cameron and so forth. Lynn said, look, what they're shooting for is a war, a back down, and they are prepared to go all the way to thermonuclear war, and of course with Obama you don't know if that's what you might get. So we're facing a countdown to something that has otherwise been thought unthinkable for about 40, at least 20 years, and maybe 30 or 40 years, and that is a thermonuclear war. A war that would have the potential to destroy the human species. As we used to understand it, as people used to think about it, even back in the 50s and 60s, when the arsenals were not as great. When one single submarine carries the explosive equivalent of hundreds of Nagasaki's and Hiroshimas. And the consequences of this would be perhaps even the end of humanity, or the beginning of the end of humanity. And that's a serious contemplation. You have to realize that the British oligarchy, the Club of Rome, just put out a study that says that the human population has reached its peak and should be reduced. Paul Ehrlich, an American who wrote The Population Bomb, when he heard this said, no, they're not tough enough. We have to reduce the population to 1.5 billion people. That's a 5.5 billion person reduction. But these people are crazy because it means extinction. Now what happened in November was the beginning of the response from the Russians in particular. When the chief of staff of the Russian military, Makarov, and then later Medvedev, made the point that these regional instabilities, Makarov in particular, could lead to a nuclear confrontation, that there are nuclear-armed nations involved, and we could have a nuclear war. Medvedev made the point that if NATO and the United States went ahead with the placement of ballistic missile defense interceptors in Poland, Romania, Czechia, and so forth, that the Russians would see this as an act of war against them. The Americans have refused to offer any legal paper that guarantees that these ballistic missiles are not aimed at Russian deterrence, but at Iran. That's the claim, but they refuse to make it an official statement. So Medvedev in November said the Iskander missiles, these are short-range missiles, will be placed in Kaliningrad and be used to knock out the ballistic missile defense. This is not unlike the confrontation of 1980-81, because not only are these ballistic missile defense systems capable of, potentially capable of reducing the Russian deterrent, or at least that's the idea. I don't know how, frankly, I'm not sure how good these systems are, but that's the thought. But they're easily turned into offensive weapons, which have a short-range strike at Russian targets. Now, Obama said to Medvedev at our meeting, I can't discuss this until after the election. You'll see the importance of this in a minute. Now, last week, Makarov repeated his statement, adding that if the tensions continue to exist, then we will have to consider a preemptive strike at the ballistic missile defense systems in Poland, Czechia, Romania, and so on. Now, obviously, this raises the question of tactical nuclear weapons, because the Iskander is capable of tactical nuclear warheads. And it also simply means setting off nuclear confrontation. This was highlighted by a statement by Medvedev, parts of which I'm going to read. Now, this is very ironic, because this was given at a international law conference in St. Petersburg. Sitting right next to Medvedev when he made this speech, and when you see pictures of it, you'll see him, is Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States. So Medvedev made this speech right in front of a major representative of the United States Obama administration. Let me just read this, not so quickly because I want people to get it. On the eve of his trip to the United States, where he will meet with President Barack Obama at the G8 nations at Camp David, Russian Prime Minister Medvedev has delivered an unequivocal message to the Western nations threatening to intervene with regime change in Syria, Iran, and elsewhere. Such actions can lead to nuclear war. This was headlined in Russia Today. Infringing national sovereignty could lead to nuclear apocalypse. And it showed Eric Holder. Now I'll read you the quotes. I would like to emphasize that we need to act in unison against such modern global challenges as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, international terrorism, organized transnational crime, drug trafficking, and the threat of natural and man-made disasters. We can achieve this only through the collective efforts of states based on undeviating respect for the supremacy of law. Many say that the international legal system has become obsolete. I have heard this said many times during my political practice. They say that its norms do not always ensure an effective response to new challenges. This is partly true, because everything eventually becomes obsolete, and the legal system is no exception. But the acute need for modernizing international law does not mean that we should abandon its founding principles, which I believe is an obvious truth. Particularly dangerous, in my view, are unilateral actions made in violation of the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations, which is the main venue where the international community brings its problems. In fact, this is the only venue we have, even though some may not like it, but it truly is the only venue. And we understand that the UN Charter calls for respecting the supreme power of law and the sovereignty of states. One more thing that I believe is important, considering my experience in politics, is the concept of state sovereignty. Now, this is referring to Syria, Libya, Iran, etc. It should not be undermined, even if for the sake of achieving some immediate political gain, including an election to a particular post. So a direct reference to wait till after the election. Such attempts threaten global order. There have been many recent examples of the concept of state sovereignty being undermined. Military operations against foreign states, bypassing the United Nations, declarations of illegitimacy of certain political regimes on behalf of foreign states, rather than the people of the country involved, and imposing various collective sanctions, again bypassing international institutions, are some of them. This does not improve the situation in the world, while rash military interference in the affairs of another state usually results in radicals coming to power. Such actions, which undermine state sovereignty, can easily lead to full-scale regional wars, even I am not trying to scare anyone here with the use of nuclear weapons. Everybody should remember this, especially when we analyze the concept of state sovereignty. So Medvedev couldn't make it clearer. The violation of the sovereignty of a nation state, which is no solution to the problems that exist, and never has been, will bring us to nuclear confrontation. And the Russians are making it clear they will not back down. Now I know you have to look at all this stuff about Putin, the demonizing of Putin and so forth. Putin represents a certain patriotic stand, and I think it was most typified in two ways. One was his VE Day speech, Victory in Europe. Because you have to, people in the United States have a certain illusion about things, and myths that come from the neocon right and so on and so forth. When FDR, during World War II, tried to work with the Russians as well as Churchill, and they were both difficult allies, because Churchill had one thing in mind: save the empire, and let the Germans and the Russians eat each other up. The Russians, the Soviets at the time, suffered a rate of casualties compared to the Western forces of about 8 to 1. That is, for every casualty on the Western side, Britain, United States, other forces, there were 8 on the Soviet side. It's estimated that 20 to 27 million people, military and civilian, lost their lives on the Soviet side during World War II. What Putin raised was indeed the fact that it was political instabilities, political vagaries, political conflicts in the West that kept the Western Front from being opened. And this is why Roosevelt tolerated Stalin and attempted to keep them in the alliance. Because if they had once again operated on a second separate peace with the Nazis, the West would have been in deep trouble. Secondly, FDR recognized that the Russians were taking the brunt of the battle. And that determined a great deal about the negotiations and so on and so forth. Putin brought that point up again. And it made the point that Russia will not, it has been through these kinds of losses and will not back down. The Chinese have said as much in, let's say, somewhat milder terms. This was followed by Putin shocking the White House. Because Putin was supposed to be at the Camp David meeting going on right now. In fact, some people have said that the reason it was moved from Chicago to Camp David, because the NATO meeting is taking place in Chicago, I think it starts on Monday, because Putin wanted it moved to Camp David for a quieter background and so forth. Well, Putin then, when Obama belatedly called Putin to congratulate him on his electoral victory, this was about 10 days after the electoral victory. Okay, meanwhile he had called Hollande up right away. He picks up the phone and Putin says, oh, by the way, I'm not coming to your party. So the Russians have made it clear to anybody who's sane, and this is, despite what people think since the fall of the wall, and whatever problems the Russians have, and they do have problems, but they are aware of their backwardness. They're trying to find the route to get economic development, particularly the development of Siberia, which has always been the question for Russia. But they're making it clear, and to be clear about it, they are the second largest thermonuclear power in the world, and they do have delivery systems. So we're talking about a situation where incalculable amounts of megatonnage would be thrust upon the planet. Now, it's very interesting that this is, so we have to recognize that as long as Obama is president, with his mentality, and with the breakdown of the financial system that he is supposed to cure by this kind of confrontation, we are on a countdown to thermonuclear war, even if the British themselves back off. Now this has been escalated, but there's an interesting point here. What has stopped the war from occurring? The U.S. military is opposed to the war with Iran, with Syria. General Dempsey, the Joint Chiefs, have opposed the war. Many military figures oppose the war. Just as a sidelight, most of the military and security figures in Israel oppose a war with Iran. For the first time, American military figures are realizing this is about Russia, not about Iran or Syria or Afghanistan or anything like that. And war has been in the air for a decade, 2 decades. Look at the last 2 decades. Iraq, Serbia, Kosovo, Iraq again, Afghanistan, Libya, the threat to Syria, the threat to Iran. You can't have a world of war that doesn't explode into world war. And if we don't take it seriously, we're going to be the victims of it. And if you listen to what Medvedev said, it should strike you if you haven't considered this possibility. It could happen at any moment. But it's been waylaid by saner forces thus far. However, very little from Congress. Walter Jones, yes. Jim Webb, yes. But that's out of 535 people. There is no leadership on this question. The reality is what might save us, the recognition. Now the other side of this is, of course, a wonderful moment. Now we have an economy, you know, where the biggest event in the economy was the initial public offering of Facebook. This is the productive core of the American economy. People who can put up fake identities, tell fake stories, and hand over all of their identification to Facebook or Google or whatever the heck goes on. This is the information society, social media. People get together to gossip about each other over the internet. So the idea was this was going to be the great boost to the American economy. Now what was going on while this was going on? Well, J.P. Morgan Chase, about a week ago, announced a $2 billion loss on a derivative bet. Now this actually is, you know, why was this such a big deal? J.P. Morgan Chase, according to Obama, and his praise of CEO Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan Chase was the best run bank of this type, this mega bank, in the United States. The most conservative, the most reliable. And what do we find? A $100 billion bet on credit default swaps. They were betting that the value of European government bonds and the euro would go up. They went down. Now, just to give you a sense of how out of control this is, Dimon said that, well, it's $2 billion, it was a $100 billion bet, it was sloppy, it was stupid, but we're still going to make money. And, you know, maybe in the next 6 months as it all unwinds, we'll find out that we lost a little bit more money, maybe $3 or $4 billion. Well, by yesterday, J.P. Morgan Chase had lost $5 billion. And this, as they say, is the tip of the iceberg. Or you might say it's the brain of the dinosaur. You know, you have something that weighs about 40 tons and has a peanut for a brain. That's J.P. Morgan Chase. Think of it that way. The biggest bank in the United States, and a peanut, or a walnut, or something. Maybe it's Jamie Dimon, he's a hardhead. Anyway, so this broke. And of course, this has raised the whole question of the regulation of these mega, super duper banks. This while the entire euro system is blowing out to the tune of $5 trillion in toxic debt at least. Now what does this raise? This has now raised the very issue that LaRouche brought up 2.5, 3 years ago, Glass-Steagall. Now I'm not going to take a long time on this. Glass-Steagall is what FDR implemented in 1933 under the bank holiday to clean out the waste, the speculation, the rot the monetarist rot, the financial speculation that's monetary values based on the growth of monetary values. No production, no reality, no anything. Monetarism is the system of the idea that the human mind doesn't exist. And it shouldn't exist. It's a problem. Don't let it exist. You're just supposed to follow your animal instincts and put a value on things that you want, even including speculative paper. And the payment of the debt engaged in garnering that speculative paper determines values in the economy. There's no scientific progress, there's no productivity, there's no physical economy. What LaRouche has stood for, in short terms, is the physical economic development as a reflection of the increasing creative productivity of the human labor force, the human society. So people are now all of a sudden saying we need Glass-Steagall. Now to give you an idea of this, there's a bill 1489 by Marcy Kaptur calling for the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall. It had about 58 or 59 co-sponsors 4 months ago. No one else co-sponsored it as the election started. In the last 2 days, 3 or 4 people have added to the co-sponsorship, including Karen Bass from California, Markey of Massachusetts, Kildee of Michigan, and so on. So Glass-Steagall can be implemented. There are many flanks opening up against Obama right now. And what we have to do, and Harley will discuss this probably in more detail, is even more importantly, as compared to 1933, when Glass-Steagall was implemented, there was a fair amount of real productive economy left. There were values that were based in the real economy and agriculture, and the states were not insolvent. This time, the ratio of the speculative bubble to the real economy is so great that once you implement Glass-Steagall, there will be nothing left to invest. The states are insolvent, agriculture is dead, aerospace has been ripped apart, the auto industry has been downsized, there is no machine tool industry. So what we need to do is do really what Hamilton did in the American Revolution. When the states were bankrupt, there was almost no economy under the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton instituted an American public credit system. Now, to just give you the controversial side of it, a credit system is different than making loans. It's not just credit. A credit system, as Hamilton understood it, was that the Treasury Department, under the direction of the Congress, emitted currency, credit, and then currency, based on the intention to bring projects into existence. Canals, ultimately railroads. Roosevelt did it with the TVA. But what this is it's credit based on nothing in the national income. You're not taking national income and allocating it. So you cut here and you invest there. What you are doing is saying that we are committed to projects which will guarantee the growth in productivity of the physical economy. And credit is being issued on that basis, on the future, on creativity, and that's exactly what Hamilton was talking about. That's the confusion about big government. This big government question is somewhat ridiculous. Every time this country has been almost destroyed, it was because of small government. The Articles of Confederation, there was no central federal government with any power. The Civil War was based on the idea of states' rights to implement a slave economy under British control. Roosevelt had to come in and use the government to rebuild the economy and prepare us for a war. So we're now at the point that Glass-Steagall could very well be implemented. There's good indication it'll be introduced in the Senate. There are increasing sponsors, and if it ever hit the floor, it would probably sail right through. We've got to be ready with the credit system, and at every step of the way, we've got to make the point that Obama is an obstacle to anything good. If you get rid of Obama, you get rid of Obama and Romney. We're going to change the election process, And if somebody says the odds are small, they're the only worthwhile odds that we have. This is not a horse race. This is about the future of humanity. And we don't have options. We're at a juncture right now, today, and the days ahead are a very unique sort. We have a choice to make, and there are not that many choices. If we don't clean out the speculative garbage and destroy the monetarist system and replace it with an American system of physical economy appropriate to today, which doesn't mean changing the rules, it means we have to have new missions. We have to build the Nawapo, the greatest development project in human history. Reshape the biosphere of North America and affect the rest of the world. Open up the Arctic, which can be both an insight into the Earth's role in the solar system and a laboratory for space development. We have to be ready for the future, thousands of years into the future. We have to create a future that has a future. We have to be able to go out into the solar system and map out the orbits of asteroids and comets and prepare the human species to inhabit the solar system and beyond. So we have shorter-term missions, medium-term missions, long-term missions that guide our sense of who we are. And we're at a juncture now where that's the choice. You don't have a lot of other choices. We can't muddle along. The one thing I will say is that one of the problems people face, and some of this is over the last 30 or 40 years, first of all, we've capitulated. And I'll talk somewhat about the pessimism later if there's time. The pessimism that runs the America, the once can-do nation, thinks nothing can be done. Why? We believe there's only one system. The monetarist system, the London and Wall Street system. I give you a funny, the New York Times big comment on Medvedev's speech when he talked about nuclear, and they referenced it. They said, well, this seems to have caused the Russian stock exchange to go down. That was their great insight into the threat of nuclear war. Yes, nuclear war might bring the stock exchange down. Might even affect the New York Stock Exchange. Who knows? And what our own citizens may be angry, may be rebelling, but they're like animals in a cage. They pace back and forth, they growl, they might bite your finger if you stick your finger in, but they won't leave the cage. They don't think there's anybody else out there to feed them. We're going to have to make the point, citizens of this country, I hope people in this room sign up to organize, and there'll be more discussion, are going to have to leave the cage and recognize that the system we're talking about is the one that built this country. And reality is what's speaking loud and clear to us now. The reality of the threat of nuclear war, the reality of the collapse of the existing monetarist system, and the fact of the matter is that LaRouche, an individual who has dedicated his life to this, has been right. When Lynn brought up nuclear war in November, I don't think anybody thought about it in a serious way. Today, it's on the table. So we have to deal with that, and part of the way of dealing with it is to bring a new system into existence, to challenge Obama both to be removed, and other people can document Obamacare, the Libyan war. He's violated the Constitution, the NDAA, the killing of American citizens. And there are moves against Obama. HCR 107 by Walter Jones, other things I won't detail. If the American citizenry leaves the cage, then Obama could be removed in days, or at least the build-up to it could occur. If we move on Glass-Steagall, he would probably try to veto it. We can ruin the Obama administration in a very short time, but we have to be committed to that war. Because you don't win these kinds of battles if you say, well, I'm only going to be in the battle if it's going to succeed. I'll do it if it wins. Joining a war when after victory is guaranteed is a little bit late to be heroic. All right? So I'll end it there, so we have plenty of time for Cody. I don't want to take too much time. If there's a quick question or two, we'll take that. We'll also take Q&A at the end. Yeah?
My name is Marcy Monroe. I'm running for U.S. Congress District 28 as a Democrat. I would like to mention, I don't know if I should pose it as a question, that nanotechnology and energy weapons are far more developed and they are in use that people know. Once Mitt Romney takes over, who is being supplied by McCain, who's a warmonger, and he wants to go to war with Iran. Yes, Middle East has nuclear weapon, but US and few Western countries have energy weapons like HARP and far beyond it. As a matter, and they will be using it, and this civilization, it will be the end of civilization. That's one fact. And as of now, the new energy weapons are open on people of America. I have collected over 500 testimonies. I have spoken to hundreds and thousands of Americans that they are being under mind control, under nanotechnology weapons and hard, their real properties, personal properties, and they are stripped of all their civil rights, and immediately they lose their jobs and they are labeled as mentally ill, and there is no, because they have no financial basis, nobody listens to them. We are even far more in danger than nuclear weapons.
Well, the only thing
and there is a war right now going in the United States of America. I hope I get elected, and I would want to bring this to U.S. Constitution and bring a resolution for people of America that it's in a violation of 8th and 13th Amendment, and this is becoming an epidemic, and it's also global. It's going worse, especially after the no due processes of the Patriot Act. Please implement this information in your...
Okay. I mean, look, we do know that energy beam weapons have been worked on. A lot of it was for the missile defense, and it wasn't really followed through. There are new physical principles that need to be discovered that would have a positive domestic basis. But let me simply make the point, these dangers, because there's no doubt that the Obama administration has no respect for civil rights. When Eric Holder says that the president making a decision about killing somebody is due process, that tells, see, the intention, the mentality is the key thing here. It's not the technology. And let me just say one thing. In terms of destruction of vast amounts and threatening the existence of the human species, do not underestimate this question of thermonuclear war. We're talking about something that's incalculable almost to the human mind. I think it's interesting that even after the first 2 bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people like Eisenhower, General Marshall, MacArthur, even people like Curtis LeMay recognized that this was a new era of weapons, and that the whole idea of general warfare was what should be unthinkable. So we can look into all these aspects, and they're worth looking at and seeing how far they are. The interesting element in this is that there's a great deal of scientific research that has been broken down, and I'll discuss some of this later on, precisely because of the cultural decline in the United States. So we should look at these things, but don't underestimate the threat of nuclear war.
You mentioned we are in cages. If people are their emotion and their mind is being controlled by these energy weapons, they may lose. It may affect their emotion.
Yeah, that's why. But you have to develop. If you develop your mind to be in control of these things, the mind is a power that I think modern science doesn't quite understand yet. Go ahead. One more question. Actually, and then I'll let Cody get started. Okay.
What, where, why, and by whom was Glass-Steagall dismantled?
I would refer you to some sites on the LPAC website. The main person was Alan Greenspan, who came out of J.P. Morgan. And indeed, throughout the this is why, in some ways, in 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act repealed Glass-Steagall. And that was to allow Citibank, under Sandy Weil, to take over Travelers Insurance and so on and so forth. Because that required such a breaking of what remained of Glass-Steagall. From 1956 on, there were amendments and bills that allowed banks to take 5% in securities, 20% in securities, and then when Greenspan, right before he became the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 84, 85, he said that the only way that we can keep our financial system going, and this is in print, is to repeal Glass-Steagall, that we need banks that can engage in all forms of risky investment. This is how you get liquidity. It's all a lot of bull, okay? So it began then, and there was a whittling away. The savings and loan, the Q law under St. Germain, and I forget the other guy. Who? Garner and St. Germain, this was in like 882. So you had this whittling away, and then Greenspan came in and said we should get rid of it. And so the Federal Reserve and the SEC began to let them do whatever they wanted to do. Now, in 1994, I think it was, Brooksy Barn was in charge of the, not the SEC, but the other one, the Federal Trade Commission. And she wanted to stop the trading in over-the-counter derivatives and so on and so forth. She was ultimately run out of office. She said this would bring destruction. So the 1999 repeal